On a cold evening in the American South, an overseer decided that fear was the fastest way to control human beings. He gave an order so cruel that even hardened plantation men fell silent. Several enslaved people were dragged from their quarters bound, bleeding, and thrown into a fenced pit where starving wild dogs had been trained to kill. This was meant to be a lesson, a warning that obedience was the only path to survival. But something went terribly wrong. The dogs did not react the way anyone expected. Instead of tearing flesh, they hesitated, circled, and then did something that froze the overseer in place. What happened next spread through the plantation like a whispered miracle, and became a story the masters tried desperately to erase from history. The overseer was known long before that day, long before the order that would seal his name in whispered fear, as a man who believed pain was the only language enslaved people understood. He had arrived at the plantation years earlier with no land of his own, no family legacy, and no patience for mercy. What he carried instead was authority borrowed from the master and a hunger to prove himself indispensable. Every crack of the whip, every punishment delivered in front of others was a performance meant to show that order came from him alone. He believed that terror, applied consistently and publicly, could turn human beings into tools that never questioned the hand that used. His voice carried across the fields like a threat, sharp and deliberate, trained to command obedience without explanation. Punishment under his watch was never private. He understood the power of witnesses. A beating delivered in silence meant little compared to one carried out before dozens of terrified eyes. He chose locations carefully. Near the quarters at dawn, beside the cotton rows at midday, or by the barns at dusk when exhaustion made fear sink deeper. Each act was designed to be remembered. The overseer did not simply enforce rules, he cultivated a reputation. Enslaved people learned to recognize his boots by sound, the way the ground seemed to stiffen beneath them when he approached. Even the most minor infractions were treated as opportunities to reinforce his control, because restraint in his mind was weakness. Those who tried to appeal to him learned quickly that reason had no place in his system. Explanations were treated as defiance. Silence was interpreted as guilt. Tears were mocked and pleas were answered with harsher blows. He spoke often of discipline as if it were a moral duty, claiming that cruelty was necessary to keep chaos at bay. In reality, his punishments grew more severe over time, as if each act needed to be worse than the last to satisfy something restless inside him. He measured success not by productivity alone, but by how little resistance he encountered, by how quickly people lowered their eyes when he. Other overseers in neighboring plantations heard stories about him and shook their heads, some in disapproval, others in admiration. To a certain type of man, his methods represented efficiency. He was rumored to have broken strong men in weeks, to have silenced outspoken women in days, to have crushed any spark of defiance before it could spread. The master rarely intervened, seeing only the numbers on ledgers and the steady flow of crops. As long as the fields stayed full and the profits rose, the overseer was allowed to operate unchecked, his authority growing broader with each season. Fear under his rule was not sudden or explosive, it was constant and suffocating. It lived in the pauses between words, in the way people measured every step, every glance. Children learned early which paths to avoid and when to disappear. Elders who had survived other plantations recognized the signs of a man who enjoyed his power too much. They warned the younger ones in hushed tones, passing down strategies for survival that revolved around invisibility. The overseer noticed these behaviors and took them as proof that his system worked, that fear was finally doing its job. He kept meticulous records of punishment, not out of accountability but pride. Marks on a page represented authority exercised, order maintained. Each entry was a reminder to himself that he was necessary, that without his hand the plantation would fall into disorder. He spoke openly about making examples, about how one person's suffering could save him the trouble of disciplining many others. To him, the enslaved were not individuals but a mass that needed to be controlled, shaped, and subdued through spectacle. He believed that the more extreme the punishment, the longer its memory would last. Over time, whispers began to circulate, that even the usual methods were no longer enough for him. Whipping, confinement, and starvation no longer seemed to carry the same satisfaction. He complained of insolence where there was none, of imagined threats, of disobedience he claimed to sense before it occurred. His temper shortened, his decisions grew harsher, and his punishments more theatrical. He wanted something that would linger in the mind long after the wounds healed, something that would make the very idea of resistance unthinkable. The enslaved people sensed this shift before any order was spoken. Fear changed texture when danger escalated. The air around him felt heavier, charged with anticipation. His eyes lingered longer on those he passed, as if evaluating them not for their labor but for their potential as examples. Conversations quieted whenever he appeared, not just out of habit, but instinct. The plantation itself seemed to brace for something worse, an unspoken understanding that cruelty once unleashed rarely retreats on its own. He justified his actions by invoking the law, tradition, and the supposed necessity of control, yet beneath those excuses lay a desire to dominate completely. Compassion had no place in his worldview. Any sign of humanity in the enslaved was interpreted as rebellion waiting to happen. He believed that by stripping away dignity he could erase hope, and by erasing hope he could guarantee obedience. What he failed to understand was that fear could only be pushed so far before it transformed into something else, something unpredictable. By the time the order was given that would define him forever, his reputation had already hardened into legend among the enslaved. They spoke of him as if he were a force of nature rather than a man, an embodiment of the violence that ruled their lives. Yet even legends are built from choices, and his choice to escalate cruelty beyond all reason came from a belief that he was untouchable, that no boundary existed he could not cross. In his mind, terror was not just a tool but a legacy, something that would outlive him and keep the plantation obedient long after his voice fell silent, a belief that set the stage for an act so extreme it would expose the limits of fear itself and reveal cracks in the power he thought absolute. The dogs were not ordinary animals wandering the edges of the plantation. They were selected, purchased, and raised with intention, turned into living weapons long before they were ever unleashed. From the time they were pups, they were denied gentleness. Hands that fed them also struck them. Voices that called them forward carried anger instead of affection. Hunger was used as instruction, pain as reinforcement. They were trained to associate human scent with pursuit, to respond to screams with excitement, to see fleeing bodies as targets rather than people. The overseer spoke of them with pride, referring to them as proof that no boundary existed between the plantation and the surrounding wilderness, that escape was not just difficult but suicidal. Their enclosure sat just beyond the main fields, far enough that their presence felt ominous rather than familiar. At night their howls drifted across the quarters, low and restless, burrowing into sleep and turning dreams into panic. Children woke crying, elders stared into the dark, and no one needed to ask what those sounds meant. The overseer wanted the dogs to be heard more often than they were seen. Fear worked best when it filled the imagination. Every snapped twig beyond the tree line, every distant bark reinforced the same message. There was nowhere to go. The dogs were introduced into punishment rituals gradually, as if easing the plantation into a new level of terror. At first they were used in chases, unleashed to track those who ran. Even when the dogs did not catch anyone, their presence alone changed behavior. People stopped looking toward the woods. Paths that once symbolized hope became symbols of death. The overseer watched this shift closely, pleased by how efficiently fear spread without the need for constant violence. The dogs were tools that worked even when they were idle. When the overseer spoke of discipline, he often gestured toward the enclosure, letting implication do the work. He described the dogs as loyal, obedient, unstoppable, qualities he claimed were lacking in the people he controlled. In his telling, the animals represented natural order, predators enforcing balance against those who dared to step out of line. He framed their use as inevitable, as if he were merely harnessing forces that already existed rather than creating them. This language allowed him to distance himself from responsibility, to treat cruelty as necessity rather than choice. The enslaved people understood the truth far better than he did. They knew the dogs were trained, conditioned, and commanded. They saw how handlers practiced drills, how specific words triggered aggression, how hunger sharpened obedience. They recognized the calculated nature of it all. The dogs were not symbols of nature but extensions of human intent, shaped to embody violence, so the men who ordered it could claim detachment. Each time the dogs were paraded past the quarters, straining against chains, it was a reminder that terror had been given teeth. Stories about the dogs circulated constantly, growing darker with each retelling. Some were true, others imagined, but all served the same purpose. Fear did not require accuracy, it only required belief. The overseer allowed these stories to spread, never correcting exaggerations, sometimes encouraging them with a smirk or a carefully placed comment. He understood that terror multiplied when people filled in the gaps themselves. The dogs became larger than life in the minds of those who lived under their shadow, creatures that waited patiently for an excuse to be unleashed. Training sessions were conducted openly, another deliberate choice. The overseer wanted witness. He wanted people to see the dogs respond instantly to command, to see how easily aggression could be summoned. When a handler released a dog toward a dragged sack or a fleeing animal, the message was unmistakable. This is what happens when something runs. This is what happens when something disobeys. The screams of prey, human or otherwise, blended into a single lesson that required no explanation. The psychological weight of the dogs extended far beyond physical punishment. Even those who were never chased felt their presence shaping every decision. Fear settled into muscles, into posture, into silence. People learned to move carefully, to avoid sudden motion, to suppress instinct. The overseer counted this as success. Productivity increased not because conditions improved, but because terror left no room for hesitation. The dogs became invisible overseers themselves, enforcing obedience through anticipation rather than action. Yet the reliance on such extreme measures revealed something fragile beneath the overseer's confidence. Control maintained through terror required constant escalation. Familiar fear dulled over time, demanding something worse to restore its edge. The dogs, once enough on their own, had to be incorporated into increasingly dramatic displays. The overseer spoke of them more often, threatened their use more explicitly, as if worried that their power might fade if not constantly reinforced. What he failed to recognize was that terror, when pushed too far, could lose its intended shape. Among the enslaved, reactions to the dogs were not uniform. Some were paralyzed by fear, their lives narrowed to survival alone. Others quietly and cautiously observed. They noticed moments when the dogs hesitated, times when commands had to be repeated, instances where instinct did not align perfectly with training. These observations were shared sparingly, in whispers, treated as dangerous knowledge. Hope was risky, but so was ignorance. Even the smallest inconsistencies mattered in a system built on absolute certainty. The overseer dismissed any suggestion that the dogs might fail him. To him, their obedience was proof of his mastery, evidence that everything could be bent to his will with enough force. He trusted the training more than his own senses, convinced that conditioning erased unpredictability. This belief allowed him to plan punishments that depended entirely on the dogs behaving exactly as intended. It never occurred to him that animals, unlike people stripped of choice, retained something uncontrollable, something that could not be fully commanded. As the dogs became central to his authority, they also became symbols of his excess. Other overseers watched with unease, recognizing that such measures drew attention, questions, potential consequences. But silence prevailed, sustained by profit and distance. No one intervened. The dogs remained, restless and powerful, waiting behind their enclosure, embodying a system that relied on fear so completely it mistook terror for permanence. A system that believed violence could be perfected, refined, and trusted without consequence. The accusation that sealed their fate was spoken casually, almost carelessly, as if it were no more serious than a missed task or a broken tool. The overseer called it theft, though what was taken was never clearly defined. A few missing scraps of food, a rumor of corn taken from a storage shed, whispers that someone had been seen near the smokehouse after dark. No evidence was presented, no names confirmed, only suspicion sharpened into certainty by the overseer's need for an example. In a system where guilt was assumed and innocence irrelevant, the charge itself mattered less than the opportunity it created. Hunger was constant on the plantation, engineered carefully to keep bodies working but spirits weak. Rations were measured, often reduced as punishment, sometimes withheld entirely. People learned to survive on almost nothing, stretching meals, sharing crumbs, chewing on roots and leaves when desperation overtook fear. The overseer knew this. He understood that hunger pushed people toward risk, and he waited for it. When something went missing, he did not ask why. He did not consider that starvation drove the act. Instead, he framed it as moral failure, as proof that harsh discipline was justified. The so-called crime was announced publicly, stripped of context and swollen with accusation. The overseer claimed that disobedience had crossed a line, that theft threatened order, that leniency would invite chaos. His words were chosen to inflame, to transform a small act of survival into an attack on authority itself. By presenting the incident as a challenge to his control, he ensured that punishment would be severe. This was not about food or property, it was about power and the need to reassert it, through fear. Those accused were selected with calculation rather than certainty. Some had spoken too freely in the past, others carried reputations for quiet defiance, and a few were simply vulnerable enough to be sacrificed without resistance. The overseer did not need the true culprits, he needed bodies that would serve the less. Once named, the accused were given no chance to speak. Silence was interpreted as guilt, protest as insolence. The outcome had been decided before the accusation was ever voiced. Within the quarters the story spread quickly,
reshaped by fear and speculation. People debated in whispers what had truly happened, whether anyone had actually taken anything at all. Some believed the accusation was entirely fabricated, a pretext for a punishment the overseer had already been planned. Others suspected someone had been careless, leaving traces that invited suspicion. But certainty was impossible, because truth held no power in a system that did not require it. The overseer framed the crime as a betrayal of generosity, claiming that the enslaved were already given more than they deserved. He spoke of ingratitude, of how kindness was repaid with theft. This narrative allowed him to recast cruelty as correction, violence as moral instruction. By exaggerating the offense, he justified an extreme response, convincing himself and others that the punishment was proportional, even necessary. What made the accusation especially dangerous was its vagueness. Theft, as defined by the overseer, could mean anything. It could mean taking food, taking time, taking breath without permission. It was a charge that could be applied to anyone at any moment. By condemning people for such an ill-defined crime, he reminded everyone that safety was an illusion, that obedience offered no real protection. The rules were not meant to be followed, they were meant to be enforced selectively. Among the accused, reactions varied. Some were too shocked to respond, struggling to understand how survival had been transformed into a capital offense. Others recognized the pattern immediately, realizing that the crime itself was irrelevant. They had seen it before in different forms, smaller punishments escalating without warning. Fear settled in not because they believed they were guilty, but because they understood they were powerless. The accusation also served another purpose. It redirected attention away from the conditions that made theft inevitable. Hunger, exhaustion and neglect disappeared from the story, replaced by narratives of criminality and moral failure. The overseer never acknowledged his role in creating desperation. Instead, he used it as evidence of inherent wrongdoing, reinforcing beliefs that justified continued brutality. In this way, the crime was not just an excuse for punishment, but a reinforcement of the ideology that sustained the system. No investigation followed, no attempt to recover what was allegedly stolen. The overseer showed no interest in restitution or prevention. His focus was entirely on spectacle. The crime was merely the opening act, the justification he needed to unleash a punishment that would eclipse the offense itself. Those watching understood this instinctively. The severity of what was coming had little to do with what had happened, and everything to do with what the overseer wanted to demonstrate. As word of the condemnation spread, fear deepened into resignation. People avoided one another's eyes, not out of indifference but self-preservation. Association could be dangerous. Sympathy could be interpreted as complicity. The accused were isolated not just physically but socially, cut off by an unspoken understanding that proximity to them might invite the same fate. This isolation was part of the punishment, an extension of the accusation that marked them as expendable. The overseer's satisfaction grew as tension tightened across the plantation. He mistook silence for acceptance, stillness for submission. In his mind, the crime had already achieved its purpose by restoring fear. What he failed to consider was how such accusations, repeated often enough, stripped meaning from punishment itself. When any act could be labeled a crime, and any crime could justify extreme violence, fear no longer functioned as intended. It became something heavier, something that pressed inward rather than outward, something that could fracture rather than control.
The order went out quietly at first, passed from mouth to mouth with the authority of inevitability. Work was interrupted in the fields, tools were set aside, and people were told to gather near the open ground by the enclosure. No explanation was offered beyond the command itself. Everyone understood what it meant when labor stopped unexpectedly under the overseer's watch. This was not mercy or rest. This was preparation. The plantation began to move as a single, reluctant body, drawn toward the center by fear rather than curiosity. Men, women, and children were herded into position, arranged so that no one could avoid seeing what was about to happen. The overseer believed that punishment lost its power if anyone was allowed to look away. He positioned the crowd carefully, adjusting lines, forcing those at the edges closer, ensuring that even the smallest child had an unobstructed view. Mothers tried to shield eyes with hands or bodies only to be shouted down. Witnessing was mandatory. Memory was the goal. The accused were brought out last, their arrival timed to heighten tension. Chains clinked softly, louder in the silence than they would have been in chaos. Heads were bowed not in shame but exhaustion. The overseer made them stand apart from the crowd, isolated yet fully visible, marked not just by accusation but by placement. Distance created division. It reinforced the idea that what was happening to them was separate from everyone else, even though everyone knew it could just as easily have been them standing there. The gathering itself became part of the punishment. Time stretched deliberately. The overseer spoke slowly, repeated himself, paused often, letting anticipation do its work. People shifted their weight, muscles stiffening, eyes fixed forward. No one spoke. Even the children sensed the danger of sound. The air felt thick, heavy with the knowledge that whatever came next was meant to be remembered long after wounds healed. The overseer addressed the crowd not as individuals but as a single problem. His words were sharp, practiced, delivered with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He spoke of order, of rules broken, of consequences that must be understood. Each sentence was aimed less at the accused and more at the witnesses. This was a lesson, and lessons required students. He reminded them that mercy was a privilege, not a right, something granted or withdrawn at his discretion. As he spoke, handlers stood nearby with the dogs, chains taut, bodies straining. Their presence was impossible to ignore. The overseer made sure of that, glancing toward them at calculated moments, allowing the crowd's eyes to follow. The dogs growled low, sensing agitation, feeding off the tension. The sound rippled through the gathered people, tightening chests, quickening breath. Fear moved faster than words ever could. Some in the crowd stared openly, unable to look away. Others fixed their eyes on the ground, memorizing patterns in the dirt, as if they could disappear into it. Elders recognized the ritual unfolding, the deliberate construction of terror. They had seen gatherings like this before, though never quite this charged. They understood that the size of the audience mattered. The larger the crowd, the deeper the fear would sink. Children clung to legs, confused by the sudden halt in routine. They sensed danger without understanding its shape. Mothers whispered urgently, trying to calm them, knowing that cries could draw attention. The overseer noticed everything. He noticed fear expressed too openly, defiance hidden in posture, grief struggling to remain silent. He believed awareness equaled control, that seeing everything made him powerful. The accused stood motionless, their stillness mistaken for submission. In truth, it was a kind of containment, a way to survive the moment without giving it more than it already demanded. They could feel the eyes on them, hundreds of them, weighing, judging, distancing themselves. Isolation deepened, not just through chains but through collective fear. No one dared step forward, not because they did not care but because care had been weaponized against them. The overseer allowed the gathering to linger, stretching the moment, until discomfort turned into dread. He wanted the crowd exhausted before the punishment even began. Fatigue weakened resistance, blurred judgment, made memory sharp. People would remember how long they stood there, how helpless they felt, how time itself seemed to conspire against them. Around the edges of the crowd, guards stood watchful, positioned to prevent movement. Escape was unthinkable, intervention impossible. The arrangement made it clear that the plantation itself had become a stage. Every person a forced participant. Even those who believed they were unseen felt watched. The overseer thrived on this awareness, on the way silence deepened under his gaze. Whispers of prayer moved invisibly through the crowd, unspoken yet shared. Some closed their eyes briefly, then opened them again, afraid that even a moment of blindness might be punished. Faith offered no protection here, only endurance. The overseer mistook this quiet for acceptance, failing to see the undercurrent of shared terror binding the crowd together. As the speech continued, details blurred, words lost meaning under the weight of anticipation. What mattered was not what was being said, but what was being delayed. The gathering existed in a suspended moment between announcement and action. This suspension was intentional, designed to stretch fear thin and wide, to make it settle into every observer. The overseer finally stepped back, surveying his work, satisfied with the stillness he had created. He had turned the plantation inward on itself, forcing everyone to witness, to remember, to internalize the message being delivered without yet being fully revealed. The crowd stood trapped in that moment, aware that whatever came next would be carried with them long after they were etched into memory by the simple fact that they had been made to watch. The moment arrived without ceremony, stripped of any remaining illusion that restraint might prevail. At a signal from the overseer, the handlers moved forward, chains tightening, grips firm and practiced. The accused were pushed ahead, their balance already compromised, their feet dragging against the ground as if instinct itself resisted what was coming. The enclosure loomed closer with each step, its rough posts darkened by age and use. The dirt inside churned from past demonstration. The crowd felt the shift immediately, a collective tightening as anticipation turned into dread. Hands forced the accused to the edge. There was no announcement of mercy, no final warning meant for them. The overseer's focus was not on the individuals but on the moment itself, on the precision with which fear would be delivered to those watching. He wanted this instant to be clean, unmistakable, burned into memory without distraction. A sharp command cut through the air, and the handlers acted. Bodies were shoved forward, not gently, not hesitantly, but with deliberate force. The accused stumbled, hands bound, unable to break their fall. The ground inside the enclosure swallowed them in a cloud of dust and panic. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some sharp and involuntary, others choked back in terror. Children cried out before being silenced, faces pressed into cloth or flesh. The sound of impact was dull, final, echoing in a space that suddenly felt far too small. Inside the enclosure, the accused struggled to orient themselves, eyes darting, breath uneven. The smell of animals, of sweat and decay, filled their lungs. Every instinct screamed to run, yet there was nowhere to go. The fence that marked the boundary was high enough to mock hope, close enough to remind them how trapped they were. Above them, beyond the posts, hundreds of eyes watched, frozen, helpless, forced to witness what fear could do when it was given authority. The overseer stood back, arms folded, observing not with urgency but satisfaction. This was the moment he believed defined control. The act itself was swift, but its implications were meant to linger. He watched the crowd as much as the enclosure, gauging reactions, noting who flinched, who stared too long, who tried to look away. Every response was information, every twitch a measure of how deeply the lesson was landed. The dogs strained against their chains, senses overwhelmed by motion and scent. Their bodies vibrated with conditioned expectation. Handlers held them back just long enough to let the fear peak, to stretch the moment until it felt unbearable. The delay was intentional, calculated to maximize terror. Inside the enclosure, the accused pressed themselves together instinctively, seeking comfort in proximity, in shared breath, in the simple fact that they were not alone. From the crowd, time fractured. Some felt seconds drag into eternity, others barely registered the passage at all. The plantation seemed to hold its breath, suspended between command and consequence. The overseer thrived in this space, this moment of absolute attention, where nothing existed except his authority, and the fear it commanded. When the final signal came, it was subtle, almost casual, a nod, a shift of posture, enough for the handlers to act. Chains loosened, the sound of metal sliding free, cut through the silence, sharper than any scream. The dogs surged forward, pulled only by instinct and training, their momentum barely contained. The enclosure transformed from a static space into something volatile, alive with movement and threat. The accused had no warning beyond the sound itself. Panic surged, muscles tightening, minds racing for options that did not exist. Some tried to crawl backward, pressing against the fence, as if it might yield. Others stood frozen, unable to reconcile fear with reality. Their reactions varied, but the terror was universal, raw and consuming. The crowd recoiled as one, a wave of horror moving through bodies packed too tightly to retreat. Even those who had steeled themselves felt something inside break. This was beyond whipping, beyond confinement, beyond anything that could be explained as discipline. This was annihilation staged as instruction. The overseer watched without blinking, convinced that this was the ultimate demonstration of power. Voices rose despite efforts to suppress them, sharp intakes of breath, muffled cries, prayers whispered too fast to form words. The sound of dogs snarling, paws tearing at dirt, filled the air, colliding with the pounding of blood in ear. The enclosure became the center of the world, everything else fading into insignificance. For the accused, the world narrowed to sensation, the heat of bodies, the pressure of the ground, the overwhelming presence of threat. Thought dissolved into instinct. They were no longer individuals accused of a crime. They were living symbols of consequence, reduced by design to objects in a lesson meant for others. The overseer believed that by stripping them of agency so completely, he was erasing the possibility of resistance elsewhere. Around the enclosure, the plantation bore witness to an act intended to define its boundaries. The overseer stood firm, convinced that this moment would echo long after it ended, that fear delivered so absolutely could not be undone. He did not consider the cost beyond obedience. He did not look for cracks in the silence he had created. He focused only on the immediate result, on the way terror radiated outward from the enclosure, embedding itself into every watching mind. The dust hung in the air, stirred by movement and chaos, catching the light and obscuring clear vision. Shapes blurred, sounds overlapped, reality fractured under the weight of what was unfolding. For those inside the enclosure, there was only the present, unbearable and for those watching, the memory was already forming,
imprinting itself with brutal clarity, a moment that would return in dreams, in silence, in the spaces between breath, long after the enclosure stood empty again. For a brief moment that felt like a mistake, nothing happened. The dogs surged forward as expected, then slowed, their bodies stiffening as if an invisible line had been drawn in the dirt. Growls faltered into low, uncertain sounds. Paws that had been trained to launch without hesitation pressed into the ground and stopped. The handlers tugged instinctively at the chains, confused by the sudden resistance, but the dogs did not respond as they had in every rehearsal, every chase, every demonstration before this one. Inside the enclosure, the accused braced themselves for impact that did not come. Muscles locked, breath caught painfully in chests, eyes squeezed shut in anticipation of tearing teeth. Seconds passed, then more, each one stretching unnaturally. Fear did not disappear, it intensified, sharpened by uncertainty. The absence of immediate violence felt wrong, disorienting, like the pause before a storm that refuses to break. The dogs circled instead of attacking, moving slowly, noses low, ears flicking. They did not bark, they did not lunge. Their movements were cautious, almost measured, as if reassessing something they had been conditioned never to question. Handlers barked commands, sharper now, tinged with irritation. The words that usually triggered instant obedience hung uselessly in the air. The crowd sensed the shift before understanding it. A ripple of confusion moved through bodies held rigid by fear. Eyes narrowed, whispers trembled at the edge of sound. This was not how it was supposed to unfold. People had been trained to expect immediacy, brutality without pause. The hesitation felt like a tear in reality, a disruption in the pattern that governed their lives. The overseer noticed at once. His posture stiffened, arms unfolding, attention snapping fully to the enclosure. This delay was not part of the design. He had built his authority on certainty, unpredictable cruelty delivered on command. Hesitation undermined that certainty. He stepped forward slightly, jaw tightening, eyes fixed on the dogs as if willing them into motion. The dogs continued to circle, their bodies tense but restrained. Some sniffed the ground near the accused, others glanced toward the handlers, torn between conditioning and instinct. Their training had taught them to pursue motion, to respond to flight, to aggression. What they encountered instead were still bodies pressed together, no sudden movement, no chase to ignite the reflex they knew. The absence of panic-driven motion disrupted the script written into them. One dog stopped entirely, standing rigid, head tilted, eyes fixed not on flesh but on face. The handlers shouted again, louder now, frustration bleeding into their voices. Chains rattled as they pulled, but the dogs resisted, weight shifting backward, nails digging into dirt. The sound of metal against metal echoed strangely, louder than expected in the stretched silence. Inside the enclosure, realization flickered cautiously. Fear still dominated, but something unfamiliar threaded through it, something fragile and dangerous. The accused dared not move, understanding instinctively that stillness mattered. Their bodies remained pressed together, breaths shallow, eyes open now, watching cautiously through terror. They did not run, they did not scream, they existed as quietly as possible, as if absence itself were a form of defense. The crowd watched, scarcely breathed. This pause became its own spectacle, one no one had prepared for. People exchanged glances they would later deny having made. Elders felt something stir that had long been buried under routine fear. Children sensed the adults' confusion and fell silent, eyes wide, absorbing the moment without understanding its significance. The overseer raised his voice, sharper, more insistent. He repeated commands, stepping closer to the enclosure, asserting presence through volume and posture. This was not just about the punishment anymore. It was about restoring control. His authority demanded response, demanded that the world behave as it always had under his hand. The dogs reacted to the raised voice with agitation, but not obedience. Their movements grew restless, uncertain rather than aggressive. One backed away slightly, then stopped, ears flattening not in readiness but discomfort. The handlers exchanged quick looks, unease flickering across their face. This had never happened before, not like this, not in front of so many witnesses. The silence thickened, heavy with possibility. The crowd leaned forward without meaning to, drawn by the rupture in expectation. Fear shifted shape. It did not lessen, but it changed, infused now with disbelief. The rules that governed terror appeared momentarily unstable, and that instability was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. The overseer felt it slipping. He could sense attention turning not toward him, but toward the anomaly unfolding inside the enclosure. His authority depended on spectacle that ended as expected. Delay invited interpretation, and interpretation invited thought. Thought was dangerous. He shouted again, gesturing sharply, demanding immediate action. The dogs paused, then one sat back abruptly, breaking the tension in a way that felt almost obscene. A murmur rose involuntarily from the crowd before being swallowed by fear. Sitting was not part of the training. It was an act of refusal no one knew how to process. The handlers yanked the chains harder, anger now overtaking confusion, but the dog remained seated, gaze steady, unthreatening. Inside the enclosure, the accused exchanged glances for the first time, eyes wide, communicating without words. They did not smile, they did not relax, but something fragile passed between them, an awareness that what was happening was not supposed to happen, that the machinery of terror had stalled. The overseer's face hardened, color rising beneath his skin. He felt exposed. Every second that passed without violence chipped at the image he had crafted so carefully. He had believed the dogs were extensions of his will, predictable as the whip in his hand. This hesitation revealed a limit he had never considered, a boundary he could not immediately cross. The crowd sensed his discomfort and feared it. When power feels threatened, it often responds with greater violence. People braced themselves for escalation, for punishment redirected outward, for fury unleashed. Indiscriminate. The hesitation felt like standing beneath a cracking dam, knowing the water would come eventually, and might come harder for having been delayed. The dogs remained uncertain, caught between command and something older, something not fully erased by training. Their bodies reflected conflict, tension vibrating beneath fur and muscle. The handlers struggled to reassert control, voices hoarse, movements increasingly frantic. The longer it lasted, the more impossible it became to pretend this was part of the plan. Time stretched grotesquely. What had begun as seconds became an unbearable interval, where meaning shifted and fear mutated. The overseer stood rigid, eyes darting between dogs and crowd, calculating damage, weighing options. Inside the enclosure, the accused remained still, aware that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile balance holding the dogs at bay. Across the plantation, something subtle but irreversible took root. Witnesses would later struggle to describe it, to explain what they had seen. All they would know was that for a moment, terror had hesitated, and in that hesitation, the certainty that governed their lives had cracked just enough to be noticed.
What followed was not chaos but something far more unsettling. The dogs began to behave in ways that contradicted every lesson beaten into them. Instead of closing in, they spread out, forming a loose circle that kept distance rather than collapsing it. Their bodies remained tense, yet their movements lacked the sharp intent the handlers expected. Heads lowered, tails shifted uncertainly, and the snarling that should have erupted into attack softened into confused, uneven sounds that carried no promise of violence. One dog stepped closer, slow and deliberate, nose twitching as it caught the scent of fear, sweat and dirt. It did not bare its teeth. It did not snap. It sniffed, paused, and then turned its head slightly, breaking eye contact in a gesture that none of the men present recognized but that spoke volumes in animal language. Another dog followed, mirroring the movement, circling wide, careful not to crowd. The formation was wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The handlers shouted again, voices cracking under strain. Carton were layered on top of each other, urgency replacing authority. Hands tightened on chains, arms straining as they attempted to force momentum where instinct resisted. The dogs responded with agitation but still not aggression. Paws scraped the dirt, bodies shifted yet none lunged. It was as if an invisible boundary existed between them and the accused, one no command could erase. Inside the enclosure, the accused sensed the change without fully understanding it. The expected rhythm of terror had broken. They could feel the dogs near them, smell their breath, hear their movements, yet the attack did not come. Fear remained, raw and overwhelming, but it now shared space with disbelief. Every second they remained unharmed felt stolen, borrowed from a future that should already have arrived. One of the dogs lowered itself to the ground, not in submission but restlessness, chin hovering just above the dirt. Another turned its head toward the handlers, ears flattening, emitting a low sound that was closer to discomfort than threat. These were not trained responses. These were decisions. The realization struck the witnesses unevenly, some recoiling from the implication, others leaning into it, desperate to understand. The crowd's reaction shifted subtly. Silence remained, but it was no longer empty. It vibrated with unspoken recognition that something unprecedented was unfolding. Eyes darted between dogs and overseer, measuring reactions, recalibrating fear. People who had never allowed themselves to hope felt something dangerous stir, not optimism but confusion sharp enough to cut through despair. The overseer's anger flared visibly now. He shouted names, cursed the handlers, accused them of incompetence. His voice carried frustration rather than command, exposing cracks in the authority he depended on. He stepped closer to the enclosure, boots grinding into dirt, as if proximity alone could force obedience from creatures that no longer responded to him as expected. The dogs reacted to his approach with unease. One backed away, another rose and repositioned itself, maintaining distance from both humans and accused. Their behavior suggested awareness not just of threat, but of contradiction. They were trained to attack or feel bodies, to respond to chaos and move. What stood before them now were still figures bound together, radiating fear but not resistance, not motion, not the cues that triggered conditioned violence. Handlers attempted a different tactic, shaking chains, using tools meant to provoke aggression. The noise startled the dogs but did not redirect them. One let out a sharp bark, then stopped abruptly, as if surprised by its own sound. The enclosure, once intended to be a site of inevitable brutality, had become a space of uncertainty that no one could fully control. Inside, the accused remained motionless, understanding instinctively that survival depended on restraint. Their muscles burned with the effort of stillness. Every breath was measured. Any movement could be fatal. Yet remaining still felt like participating in something larger than themselves, something they dared not define. They were not resisting, they were existing, and existence itself seemed to disrupt the machinery designed to destroy them. The overseer sensed the crowd's attention drift. This was dangerous. Authority relied on inevitability, on the belief that commands always produced results. What unfolded now challenged that belief. In front of hundreds of witnesses, he raised his voice again, louder than before, demanding immediate compliance, demanding violence to restore order. The dogs responded by spreading farther apart. Distance increased instead of shrinking. Their bodies remained coiled with tension, but their focus fractured, attention shifting between handlers, overseer and the still figures inside the enclosure. No single command dominated their awareness. Training clashed with instinct, and instinct refused to disappear. A murmur rippled through the crowd, barely audible but impossible to erase. It was not celebration, it was recognition. People sensed that what they were witnessing would be remembered, regardless of how the moment ended. Fear remained dominant, but it now shared space with something else, something that did not fit neatly into the hierarchy that governed their lives. The overseer gestured sharply, ordering the handlers to act, to force the dogs forward physically if necessary. The handlers hesitated, not out of sympathy, but uncertainty. They had never been trained for refusal. Their authority over the dogs depended on cooperation, not force. The animals were powerful, unpredictable when pressed, and the situation teetered on the edge of losing all control. One dog stepped toward the accused again, closer this time, then stopped and sat, chest rising and falling rapidly. Its gaze moved across faces, lingering briefly on eyes widened by fear. There was no hunger in the look, no anticipation of attack. The gesture sent a shock through the onlookers more powerful than any scream could have. Sitting was an act that stripped the moment of its intended violence, replacing terror with something incomprehensible. The overseer felt the weight of the crowd's reaction even before he heard. He sensed disbelief turning inward, reshaping assumptions people had been forced to carry for years. He recognized the danger too late. Once terror faltered, even briefly, it could not be restored unchanged. Fear depended on certainty, and certainty had been interrupted. The dogs remained where they were, bodies tense but restrained, breathing hard, eyes alert. The enclosure had transformed into a space, no longer governed solely by human command. The spectacle, designed to reinforce absolute control, now revealed its limits, exposing the fragile dependence of terror on obedience, and the unpredictable nature of creatures never meant to carry the full weight of cruelty imposed upon them. The overseer's reaction was immediate and visible, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and panic. His face flushed, muscles tightening, jaw clenching so hard that veins stood out along his temples. Authority, which had always been effortless, now felt fragile, slipping through his fingers in a way that terrified him more than any disobedience he had previously encountered. Every instinct screamed for control, for order, for the immediate resumption of the punishment he had planned meticulously, but control had evaporated before he could seize it. The spectacle had turned against him, and he realized, perhaps too late, that he was no longer fully in command. He shouted at the handlers, his voice cracking under stress, commands overlapping in a chaotic torrent.
Move them. Forward. Attack. The repetition of words meant to impose authority sounded hollow even to his own ear. The dogs, which had been the instruments of his dominance, were no longer predictable extensions of his will. They hesitated, they circled, and they refused to obey the sequences drilled into them over months of condition. The overseer's certainty was shattered, and with it, the illusion that he could manipulate fear with perfect precision. The crowd of enslaved people sensed the shift immediately. They had watched the enclosure with terror, expecting carnage to unfold as it always had. But now, hesitation replaced action. The dogs circled without attacking, and the overseer's furious efforts to assert control only highlighted the failure of his plan. Whispers flickered at the edges of consciousness, suppressed quickly out of instinct and self-preservation, yet the message was unmistakable. The power that had been absolute could falter. The realization was subtle but transformative, infecting even those who remained paralyzed by fear. The overseer's eyes darted from dog to handler to enclosure in rapid succession, as if searching for a single point of failure he could exploit to restore authority. Each movement of the dogs felt like a betrayal, a challenge to the system he had built on certain. He leaned forward, gesturing violently, stomping his feet, and threatening with his whip, attempting to impose human will on creatures whose instincts had temporarily overridden training. But instinct proved stronger than instruction, and the dog's hesitancy persisted. Inside the enclosure, the accused felt the change immediately. The tension in the air shifted from expectation of pain to something unfamiliar, a strange liminal space where danger still existed, but the immediacy of it had softened. Their bodies remained coiled with readiness, yet their terror now mingled with disbelief. Movement became calculated, a delicate dance of survival where even breath could invite scrutiny. Stillness was no longer just an act of submission, but a subtle form of influence over the chaos surrounding them. The overseer attempted to regain control by raising his voice further, pacing along the edge of the enclosure, and gesturing with whip in hand. His words meant to enforce obedience, instead exposed desperation. Commands repeated, shouted, and reinforced with visible anger. But authority is rooted in perception, and perception had begun to fracture in the eyes of the crowd. Even the handlers, trained and conditioned to respond immediately, faltered. They pulled on chains, adjusted grips, shouted instructions, yet the dogs resisted with subtle shifts, unwilling to comply fully. The disruption of expectation created a ripple across the plantation. The crowd, initially frozen in fear, became keenly aware of the anomaly. Their minds raced to interpret the hesitation, to find meaning in what should have been a predictable sequence of punishment. Some feared that the pause was a prelude to something even worse, while others quietly wondered if the overseer's authority could truly be challenged. The very fact that the dogs did not act as programmed introduced uncertainty into the lives of everyone present, planting seeds of thought that authority could be fallible. The overseer's attempts at intimidation escalated, moving from verbal commands to aggressive gestures, snapping the whip toward the dogs and striking at the dirt, attempting to elicit a reaction. Each strike, each bark of command, only reinforced the strangeness of the moment. The dogs did not attack. They adjusted, circled, and positioned themselves in ways that no training had prepared for. The scene, intended as a display of absolute control, had inverted into an exhibition of unpredictability, revealing the limits of power built purely on fear. Internally, panic began to spread through the overseer. He understood the optics of failure as clearly as anyone. The crowd was witnessing his inability to execute authority, and that perception could erode obedience faster than any punishment. The realization was unbearable. For years he had relied on spectacle and fear to maintain order, assuming that obedience was guaranteed by his willingness to inflict suffering. But the hesitation of the dogs had introduced unpredictability, and unpredictability was a threat to the foundations of the system he had constructed. The accused, sensing the overseer's increasing agitation, became acutely aware of the subtle shift in balance. While still at risk, they recognized that fear alone might not determine the outcome. The hesitation of the dogs had introduced an opening, however fragile, in a system that had long been inflexible. Even the smallest recognition of this dynamic altered perception. The immediate danger had not disappeared, but the parameters had changed. What was expected, the seamless continuation of terror, was interrupted, and the overseer's struggle to maintain control became a visible part of the spectacle. The crowd continued to watch, eyes wide, some frozen by fear, others leaning forward in disbelief. Even children who could not fully comprehend the situation sensed the tension, the breakdown of the expected order. Whispers, suppressed quickly, passed through the group like a quiet current, carrying with them a shared understanding that authority was not infallible. The overseer's reaction, frantic and uncoordinated, only amplified the perception that the natural order of power was faltering, and that the machinery of terror could be disrupted under certain circumstances. The overseer, however, refused to relinquish control. He shouted with increasing force, gestured violently, and attempted to manipulate the dogs physically through chains and prods. The dogs responded partially, restless and reactive, but not fully obedient. Their hesitation persisted. Each failed attempt at enforcement was a visual representation of a system unraveling under its own reliance on fear. The audience witnessed not just the limitation of human authority, but the vulnerability of power dependent entirely on domination and spectacle. The atmosphere within the enclosure became a complex interplay of tension, awareness, and calculation. The accused, conditioned by years of submission, moved carefully, measured each breath and shift of their awareness of the overseer's faltering control, introduced a subtle psychological advantage. Stillness became a form of negotiation. Survival required not aggression, but attentiveness and restraint. The dogs, responding in ways neither fully predictable nor fully controlled, created a space where instinct overrode human imposition. The overseer's desperation grew in tandem with the audience's realization. Each second of hesitation stretched authority thinner, and the crowd's understanding of what was unfolding shifted imperceptibly but irreversibly. The overseer attempted escalation, but the escalation was met with adaptation, not obedience. The scene had transformed from punishment into a study of power, fear, and the limits of control. Observers understood that the ultimate weapon instilled terror could falter, that absolute obedience was never guaranteed, and that even the most disciplined instruments of cruelty might defy expectation when confronted with the unpredictable. The overseer's fury was no longer contained. Shouts, gestures, and threats became frantic, uncoordinated, and overcompensated. Authority, long assumed to be unshakable, was now visibly fragile. The crowd sensed it, and a subtle shift in perception spread, one that would leave traces long after the event ended. The pause, the hesitation, and the inability of the overseer to fully control the dogs exposed the vulnerability of a system built entirely on fear and submission, challenging assumptions that had governed behavior for years and creating a moment of tension that held everyone in suspended awareness. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately after the incident, spreading through the quarters in whispers that carried equal parts fear and awe. People spoke cautiously, their voices low and measured, aware that words could be dangerous even when no one seemed to be listening. The story of what the dogs had done or failed to do traveled faster than any official announcement, carried on by those who had witnessed the moment and those who had heard fragments secondhand. Every retelling added subtle embellishments, emphasizing hesitation, the strange circling of the dogs, the overseer's visible panic, and the way the accused had remained unharmed against expectation. The enslaved people understood the importance of these rumors. They were not simply stories, they were information, and information was survival. In a system designed to erase agency, knowledge became a form of power. Knowing that the overseer could be unsettled, that the dogs could hesitate, that the machinery of fear was not flawless, gave them a sliver of understanding that could be used to navigate danger. Each whisper became a thread in a delicate network, connecting individuals across the plantation through shared awareness. Some rumors took on mythical quality. Accounts described the dogs pausing as if recognizing innocence, forming protective circles, or responding to some unseen force that overrode training. Others claimed that the animals had looked the overseer directly in the eye and refused to attack. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, carried a moral weight. They implied that cruelty had limits, that fear was not absolute, and that even the instruments of domination could act outside the will of the oppressor. The impact of these rumors on the enslaved community was profound. Fear remained, but it was now accompanied by a cautious hope, a subtle recognition that control was neither perfect nor permanent. People began to speak in coded ways about what they had learned, passing messages that contained warnings, strategies for avoidance, and at times inspiration. The knowledge that the overseer could be challenged, even indirectly, infused their movements and decisions with new subtlety. Survival required discretion, but awareness changed the nature of that survival. Elders played a key role in transmitting the story. They recounted the events in measured tones, emphasizing the danger while highlighting the anomaly that had occurred. These retellings were layered with lessons: the unpredictability of life under slavery, the fragility of power based solely on fear, and the potential for moments of unanticipated mercy or intervention. Children listened, absorbing both the narrative and its implications for behavior. The story became a tool for education, caution, and preparation, passed down with care to ensure that its lessons endured. The rumors also had a psychological effect on the overseer and other authority figures. While the enslaved spread their whispers carefully, the overseer could sense that the narrative was evolving in ways beyond his control. The story of hesitation, of defiance by trained animals, and of the momentary undermining of his authority circulated quietly but relentless. Even if not directly confronted, the knowledge that perception had shifted was destabilizing. Power depends not only on action but on belief, and the changing narrative threatened the belief in the overseer's absolute control. Observers noted subtle shifts in behavior. People who had previously avoided eye contact with authority began to study patterns more carefully, noting moments of vulnerability or hesitation. They remained cautious, yet the rumor of the dog's hesitation introduced a dimension of awareness that had been suppressed for years. The stories encouraged strategic thinking, the kind of mental maneuvering that could reduce risk, even if it could not eliminate it entirely. Knowledge became a shield, small but significant, against the omnipresent threat of violence. The rumors also fostered a sense of communal connection. Each retelling, each whispered account, reinforced bonds among the enslaved. Shared knowledge became a form of solidarity, a reminder that while individuals were isolated physically and socially, their experiences were collectively understood. The story of what happened in the enclosure was transformed from an isolated event into a touchstone for the community, a moment of shared witness that subtly shifted the dynamics of power and awareness. As the stories circulated, the overseer became increasingly conscious of the implication. Even without direct confrontation, he perceived that his authority had been publicly questioned. The dogs, intended to be symbols of unquestioned power, had failed to behave as expected, and the narrative of that failure had spread. Every whisper carried the potential to undermine obedience, to plant seeds of doubt, and to encourage even the smallest acts of resistance. The overseer's reliance on fear, as the singular instrument of control, had exposed a vulnerability he could not easily repair. The impact of the rumors was amplified by the human tendency to remember anomalies over routine. Cruelty, brutality was expected, codified into daily life, and thus often passed into memory as background noise. The hesitation, however, was irregular, dramatic, and inexplicable. People recalled it with vivid clarity, recounting the tension, the pauses, the uncharacteristic behavior of the dogs, and the overseer's visible panic. This vividness ensured that the story endured in the collective memory far longer than any ordinary punishment. The narrative also carried moral undertones, subtle and implicit. It suggested that absolute submission was not the only possible reality, and that even those instruments of oppression could act unpredictably, in ways that human cruelty could not fully dictate. This realization, though fragile, reinforced the importance of awareness, observation, and caution, teaching that survival sometimes relied as much on perception and timing as on physical endurance. The story became a lesson in strategy, endurance, and the limitations of fear. Ultimately, the rumors created a ripple effect that went beyond simple storytelling. They influenced behavior, reinforced communal bonds, altered perceptions of authority, and demonstrated the fragile balance upon which the overseer's power rested. They became a living testament to the carrying lessons that extended beyond the immediate moment and ensuring that the story of hesitation, resistance, and unexpected disruption would remain alive in memory, discussion, and the quiet calculations of those forced to navigate life under constant surveillance and threat. Even as the days passed, the story continued to evolve, reshaped by retelling and reflection. Each whisper added nuance, detail, or interpretation. The incident in the enclosure, once a moment of immediate terror, became a symbol of uncertainty and power, of limits to control, and of the ways in which even the most meticulously planned cruelty could be disrupted, if only. It became a story that was both cautionary and inspiring, carrying lessons that resonated quietly in the hearts and minds of those who survived to tell.
The aftermath of the incident was a complex mixture of relief, fear, and disbelief, rippling through every corner of the plantation. In the immediate hours that followed, the overseer retreated to the relative safety of his quarters, fuming privately while attempting to reconstruct the authority that had been so publicly shaken. He paced back and forth, whip in hand, his mind racing through contingencies, blaming the dogs, the handlers, and even the accused themselves for the failure to deliver punishment as intended. To him, this disruption was unacceptable, an anomaly that could not be tolerated if control was to remain intact. The handlers, meanwhile, were left to manage the dogs, whose behavior remained unpredictable long after the initial moment. The animals no longer responded to commands with the immediacy and precision they had shown before. Their hesitation, their circling, their refusal to attack fully, introduced a variable that no amount of discipline could fully eradicate. The handlers realized that the lesson intended to cement fear had instead exposed the limits of conditioning, leaving both them and the overseer grappling with an uncertainty that unsettled the foundation of the entire system of control. Among the enslaved, the incident became a topic of quiet but intense discussion. People replayed the sequence of events, dissecting every gesture of the overseer, every movement of the dogs, every decision made by the accused. Each retelling served to reinforce understanding and awareness, creating a collective memory that was as much a survival tool as a shared story. The fact that the expected cruelty had been disrupted introduced a new element into their perception of power, the realization that authority, even when brutal, was not infallible. This subtle shift in perception altered behavior in ways both overt and covert. Individuals became more observant, noting small inconsistencies in the overseer's commands, subtle hesitation in the handlers, and the ways that fear could be manipulated. While outward submission remained necessary, inwardly, people began to recognize moments of potential leverage, however fragile. The incident became a benchmark for assessing risk, a reference point for decision-making in situations that required careful negotiation with power and survival. The overseer's reputation, though outwardly maintained through continued displays of cruelty and authority, was quietly eroded. The memory of the dog's hesitation lingered among the enslaved as evidence that his will could be resisted, even indirectly. This quiet erosion of fear did not translate into open defiance, but it did create a psychological shift. Obedience was no longer guaranteed simply by the presence of instruments of punishment. Authority required more than spectacle. It required the perception of inevitability, and that perception had been fractured. The accused, for their part, survived the moment physically intact, but forever changed psychologically. The terror they had endured, compounded by the unpredictable behavior of the dogs, left a lasting impression that would influence every subsequent interaction with authority. They had been placed in a situation designed to annihilate not only the body but the spirit, and the partial failure of that design became a powerful if delicate form of agency. Their survival was proof that even under extreme oppression, circumstances could unfold in ways that were not entirely dictated by those in power. The incident also reverberated symbolically. Within the quarters, it became a story of endurance and subtle resistance, a reminder that the mechanisms of fear were not absolute. Elders recounted the events with emphasis on the lessons, the limits of cruelty, the capacity for unpredictability, and the importance of observation and stillness. Children absorbed these lessons indirectly, internalizing strategies for survival that extended beyond the immediate physical threats of labor or punishment. The narrative became a tool for cultivating awareness, resilience, and a nuanced understanding of power dynamics. Over time, the overseer attempted to reassert dominance through heightened vigilance, stricter punishments for perceived infractions, and increased attention to the behavior of both people and animal. Yet the memory of the dog's hesitation had planted seeds of doubt that could not easily be eradicated. Every act of discipline was now measured against the remembered anomaly, a reminder that authority was contingent, not guaranteed. This underlying tension altered the social dynamics of the plantation subtly but significantly, influencing behavior, conversation, and perception in ways that the overseer could neither fully predict nor control. The dogs themselves became agents of a new kind of unpredictability. Though trained and conditioned, they had demonstrated that instinct and circumstance could override instruction. Their behavior during the incident remained a source of fascination, fear, and cautious hope. For the enslaved, it was proof that even the most carefully constructed instruments of power had limitations, and that understanding those limitations could be a form of protection. The animal's unexpected actions were remembered as a pivotal moment, one that blurred the line between threat and opportunity, fear and possibility. Psychologically, the overseer faced the challenge of reconciling failure with authority. He had relied on absolute obedience, on terror codified into ritual, on the assumption that fear could be manufactured and maintained through demonstration alone. The hesitation of the dogs undermined this assumption, forcing him to confront the vulnerability inherent in systems built entirely on domination. Though outward appearances were maintained through continued displays of violence, internally, the certainty that had sustained his confidence was irreparably shaken. For the enslaved, the incident became a quietly transformative narrative. It was shared in hushed tones, reinterpreted and re-emphasized according to context, yet the core truth remained: fear was not omnipotent, cruelty was not unassailable, and even the instruments of oppression could be disrupted under certain circumstances. The story reinforced the importance of attentiveness, patience, and subtlety, offering a mental map for navigating life under constant threat. It became a symbol of the potential for survival, resistance, and awareness in the face of overwhelming power. The incident's legacy endured because it revealed the fragility of authority dependent on fear alone. The dog's hesitation, the overseer's panic, the collective witnessing by the enslaved, all combined to create a moment that challenged the assumptions of control. The story persisted, growing in resonance with each retelling, becoming a cornerstone of shared memory and understanding. It served as a reminder that power, no matter how absolute it appeared, was never entirely unchallenged, and that even in the harshest circumstance, moments of unpredictability could create space for reflection, survival, and subtle forms of defiance. The story in the end became more than a single event. It became a testament to the limits of cruelty and the resilience of those who endured it. The hesitation of the dog, the unraveling of the overseer's control, and the survival of the accused sent a quiet, powerful message that reverberated across the plantation and into memory. Fear, no matter how carefully engineered, could falter, and even the smallest spark of unpredictability could disrupt oppression. It reminded everyone who witnessed or heard the tale that authority is never absolute, that survival often lies in patience, awareness and courage, and that the human spirit, even when confined, still possesses the capacity to endure, resist, and quietly assert its presence. This moment of unexpected defiance became a symbol, an enduring echo that cruelty could be challenged, and that hope, however fragile, could survive in the most impossible of circumstances.